Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Dowshan Humzah, one of the board and council members here at Gresham College, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here at Bernard's Inn, and for those online as well. This is our annual lecture delivered by Britain's leading legal professionals and held in partnership with Gray's Inn. This recognises the long relationship that we at Gresham College have had here at Bernard's Inn with Gray's Inn. On a personal note, it's my view that Gresham College, unfortunately, is the city's best-kept secret. It should be the worst. We provide free education for all. Learning not because you need to, but learning because you want to. Debate and challenge because you want to. Everyone benefits from our world-leading professors and distinguished speakers. No greater example than tonight. But before we begin with a formal introduction, a quick bit of housekeeping. For those here at Bernard's Inn, we have QR codes which can be scanned, and we use that for all of our lectures to collate questions. The demand's been great. I've already got questions coming in, let me add. For those online, you can obviously submit questions through the website. So, it is my great pleasure to introduce this year's Gray's Inn reading. And our speaker for this evening is none other than Charles Leslie Faulkner, Baroness Falconer of Thoroton. Lord Falconer is known to many of us as a distinguished and prominent British Labour politician and a barrister who's made significant contributions to the legal and political landscape of the UK. I was reflecting earlier and like to think of Lord Falconer as a trailblazer as well. We'll come to that. In 2003, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, Lord Falconer was appointed Lord Chancellor in collaboration with the then Lord Chief Justice. He established and detailed a new relationship between the judiciary and the executive, which was enshrined in the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. I said his reforms were transformative and trailblazing. These included the creation of the UK Supreme Court, the establishment of a commission to appoint judges, the appointment of a full-time independent judge as the head of judiciary for England and Wales, and also the introduction of an elected speaker for the House of Lords. In 2007, Lord Falconer became the first Secretary of State for Justice, uniting the courts, the prisons, and justice policy under one department for the first time in history. I'm sure we'll have a debate on some of those reforms as well, but it's my absolute delight in welcoming Lord Falconer. Please, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that incredibly kind welcome. I greatly appreciate it. When I accepted the invitation to speak, I was very honoured to accept the invitation. First of all, I noticed, looking at my very distinguished predecessors who have done this lecture before, they're basically all very distinguished judges or academics. And you've very rarely asked for a politician to deliver the speech. Today, I'm going to talk about the Constitution and ask the question, in effect, has politics triumphed over the law and constitutional propriety? And in order to see whether or not that has happened, it's necessary to look not just at the legal and constitutional end, but also the role that the politicians play. So I assume that that is what Peter Coulson, the treasurer of Gray's Inn, had in mind when he asked me. So I'm very honoured to be here and able to talk. I didn't know when I was going to talk, as I've said, that a general election was going to be in place. And had I known that a general election was taking place, I would have accepted even more enthusiastically than I did accept. The two things that I think are very substantially in play in relation to the general election is the willingness of governments to stick with the law, and the other thing is the incredibly dangerous position that the justice system is in. And it's not just the criminal justice system, though that is in a terrible position, but it is also the family justice system and the civil justice system. However, I didn't know that it was going to be a general election, so I'm not going to talk about the terrible state of the justice system, but I'm going to stick with what I was going to talk about all along, which is the question of law and constitutionality. In delivering this lecture, I make it clear I'm not speaking on behalf of the Labour Party, though I should make it clear that I've been a member of the Labour Party all my adult life. I really hope that Labour win this election as big as possible. And I have a particular interest in the result in the general election because my own son is standing to be a Labour MP in Lincoln. So I make clear to you that I am biased completely in relation to the politics of where we are, but I am not going to talk about politics. I'm going to talk about constitutional arrangements. I address this evening the constitutional arrangements for holding government to the law and the Constitution. And the question is the executive becoming ever less restrained by the law and the Constitution at a time when a government is becoming ever less trusted? My answer to that question, and I'll set out the reasons, is yes. The executive is becoming ever less accountable to the law and much more willing and able to act unconstitutionally than previously. What we do about it, I think, will depend on whether the last decade and more was an aberration rather than a trend. But my own view is that political expediency is in the ascendancy, and in a world of an unwritten constitution with protection only for black letter law, politics is currently trumping principle. A government has political, constitutional, and legal accountability. Its political accountability at its summit depends on the principle a government can only stay in power for as long as it enjoys the confidence of the House of Commons. That accountability is part of the Constitution. It is only enforceable politically. The removal of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss in quick succession suggests that aspect of the Constitution continues to work well. To the two examples of Johnson and Truss, we should, however, add the example of Theresa May. She lost her flagship policy, the reason that she was Prime Minister, her deal negotiated with the EU for Brexit, by first of all over 200 votes in the House of Commons, and then by over 150 votes before the Speaker ruled that she could not try again because the House of Commons had already ruled on that issue. Even though it was beyond argument in the face of those unprecedented rebuffs that she did not enjoy the confidence of the Commons, she stayed on as Prime Minister with the active collusion of her party. This is in marked distinction to Mr. Neville Chamberlain, who resigned in May 1940 after winning a vote on the adjournment of the House of Commons, which was treated as a vote of confidence. But he won the vote. Mr. Chamberlain resigned because the size of the Tory rebellion made it clear to him that even though he enjoyed a majority, he had in effect lost the House's confidence. That was a clear example of what Professor Peter Hennessy described as the good chaps form of government. The good chaps form of government has definitely gone as far as that principle of retaining the confidence of the House of Commons is concerned. But whether there has been, in practice, a change in the approach to the issue of whether the Prime Minister and his government enjoy the confidence of the Commons is not the subject of this lecture. If there has been a loss of confidence, it is only something that politics can deal with. There is no place for the law or the courts in this aspect of accountability. And if the position is that the government continues in power despite having lost the confidence of the Commons, then it's for the electorate to decide subsequently whether that is something that they approve of. May eventually was forced out by Johnson, and then Johnson won a massive election, ultimately because I suspect the public did not want the continuing chaos of what had happened when somebody was the Prime Minister but didn't have the confidence of the Commons. But it's a political issue, not a legal issue. But there is more to the Constitution than the question of whether the government continues to enjoy the confidence of the Commons. Recent experience, as I will deal with later, suggests that traditional constitutional norms, in particular the separation of powers between the courts on the one hand and the executive and the legislature on the other, and the balance of power between the executive and the legislature, are now no longer being applied in full. In this lecture, when I talk of holding the government to the law and the Constitution, I'm using the phrase to denote the executive complying with black letter law and also complying with clear constitutional conventions, which may or may not be enforceable by the courts, but are unquestionably parts of the Constitution. Being able effectively to hold a government to the law and the Constitution has, I believe, 4 elements. First, an independent judiciary and a properly resourced court system willing and able to find against the government when the law dictates. Second, access to justice for potential challenges to executive action. Third, commitment within government to act in accordance with the law and the Constitution, and effective means to enforce that commitment. And finally, ensuring the continuation of legal and constitutional structures which apply appropriate limits to executive action. As to the court's role in ensuring compliance with the law, I have absolutely no doubt about the robust independence of our judiciary. Until very recently, judges have not, as a group, been in play politically. Over most of the last 50 years, they had not been seen either as too right-wing or too left-wing. They genuinely have transcended political typecasting, with the possible exception of the Irish terrorist cases. That has, to some extent, changed. The enemies of the people headline, unrepudiated by the government for days, and indeed supported by one minister at the time and a senior minister, and the attacks on, quote, lefty lawyers by ministers, carries with it the notion that judges and lawyers are part of an elite standing in the way of liberating the country from an over-woke, over-European, over-metropolitan, overrun with immigrants country. It is important not to exaggerate the extent to which the judges are in political play in this way. They have shown immense good sense in hardly responding to the attacks, and they retain very widespread public confidence, much more confidence than the politicians do. But the next few years may be rocky. The maintenance of constitutional democracy depends on the main political parties continuing to support and have confidence in the judiciary. Otherwise, holding a future government to the law and the Constitution becomes much harder. I have no anxiety whatsoever that any incoming Labour government will undermine the standing of the judiciary. A former DPP would not do that. But the growth of the far right has carried with it attacks and the non-acceptance of institutions on which the maintenance of our democracy depends. And the growth of the far right infects the centre-right. It was not just the Farages who attacked lawyers for doing their job. It was politicians holding the highest positions in the state. The consequence of putting the judges in play in this way is that judges inevitably become careful to pick their battles with the executive. And that ultimately weakens the independence of the judiciary. Not because they are cowed, but because they have an eye to politics. Politicians from the mainstream play with fire if they undermine our judges. Undermine them, and you undermine the proper functioning of a constitutional democracy. After he lost the prorogation case, Prime Minister Johnson, supported by his then Attorney General Geoffrey Cox, suggested the Supreme Court decision was, quote, political, and in consequence, the process for appointing judges should become more political. He had and has the support of Professor Eakins, the distinguished professor of constitutional law at the University of Oxford. He, Boris Johnson, and Geoffrey Cox argue that, and I quote, the Lord Chancellor be allowed to exercise a real discretion in making senior judicial appointments, selecting from a short list of well-qualified candidates. The system now works well in terms of quality and independence. There have been criticisms of the length of time the process can take, and that ministers do not have a sufficient interest in the outcome, and that progress on diversity has been insufficient. The first and the last of these critiques have some validity, but I am profoundly against giving ministers more say. It was, I believe, profoundly fortunate that after the loss of the prorogation case by the government, it was not open to the Lord Chancellor to interview a short list of judicial candidates for Chief Justice and select the one who would be most in favour of deference to the state. An appointment system which promotes judicial independence is vital. The current system does that and should be left well alone. A final point on protecting the independence of judges. They should, if possible, have a strong defender in government who should be able to speak up for them in private and in public. That is the role that the Lord Chancellor should play and has statutory power to play. Sometimes Lord Chancellors do it well, and sometimes they don't. I believe that that role for the Lord Chancellor would be immeasurably strengthened if the ministerial code spelt out their role in defending the judges, prescribed that ministers must desist or withdraw any criticism if asked to do so by the Lord Chancellors, and that the rules of collective responsibility do not apply to the Lord Chancellor when discharging this role. I do not think the holder of the office needs to be a lawyer. They need to be somebody strong-minded enough to know when to stand out against colleagues' attacks on judges. Character and stature, not profession, are, I believe, the key. I've focused so far on the independence of the judges as a vital component of holding the state to the law. The importance of this requirement should not overshadow two further aspects I referred to earlier in the first two of my list of 4 conditions. First, there has to be a sufficiently resourced justice system, and second, those who wish to challenge the state should be able to access the justice system. It would never occur to us not to properly fund elections. It's vital to democracy. But just as vital to a constitutional democracy is the rule of law. And that means courts sufficiently resourced to ensure there is not undue delays in hearing cases, and legal aid arrangements which allow those who have a challenge to the state with legal merit to pursue that challenge. Without the rule of law, there is no sustained democracy. If there is not the rule of law, the winner in an election can stay in power forever. There is a price to pay to protect our constitution, which is not just the cost of ballot boxes. It is also the cost of a properly resourced justice system and proper access for all to that system. Let me move to the third of my 4 conditions for constitutional arrangements which hold the government to the law. That is, a commitment within government to act in accordance with the law and the Constitution, and effective means to enforce that commitment. Without doubt, the most important means of holding a government to the law is the justice system. But much of what goes on in government never gets to the courts, either because the public never hear of it or because no one challenges it. And in our system, sovereignty resides in Parliament, which mostly the executive controls. Primary legislation can be used by a government to get round the rule of law and constitutional norms. As a nation, we undoubtedly have a deep and long commitment to the rule of law. We promote it around the world. It is the foundation both of our freedoms and our prosperity. It is the source of huge amounts of earnings through expenditure on UK lawyers. In 2022, the UK legal services sector generated revenue of £42.7 billion, much of it coming from international clients choosing to resolve disputes and make agreements in accordance with English law. For such a commitment to be convincing and reliable, it must be steadfast. Investors in the UK and the citizens of the UK alike need to know that the commitment applies come what may and does not give way to the political demands of the government of the day. Within government, ministers and civil servants alike are bound by the Ministerial Code and the Civil Service Code, respectively, which requires them to comply with the law, including international law. The government has well-regulated rules for ensuring that all that it does complies with the law. To the extent there are disagreements about the law within government, they are resolved by the opinion of the law officers. Their views are authoritative both on the law and the Constitution. This legal ecostructure has been significantly undermined in recent years. The Internal Markets Act expressly allowed the government to break the terms of the EU-UK-Irish Protocol, even though such a breach would inevitably involve a breach of international law. The Advocate General, Lord Keane of Ely, a distinguished Scottish lawyer, resigned in the face of this abandonment of law. The Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Act passed in the dying days of this recent Parliament. It was a clear breach of the constitutional principle of the separation of power between the courts on the one hand and the executive and the legislature on the other. As is well known, the Supreme Court had concluded Rwanda was not a safe country to return immigrants within the meaning of the immigration rules. These rules provide that to qualify as a safe country, the principle of non-refoulement must be respected. The principle of non-refoulement requires that the refugee should not be returned to a place in which he may face persecution. The immigration rules permit the courts to determine whether a country is safe in accordance with the rules as a primary issue of fact, not simply on the basis of a Wednesbury challenge to a finding of a minister or an immigration officer. The Supreme Court found unanimously there was, and I quote, a culture within Rwanda of, at best, inadequate understanding of Rwanda's obligations under the Refugee Convention. And they went on and said, it is also apparent from the evidence that significant changes need to be made to Rwanda's asylum procedures as they operate in practice before there can be any confidence that it will deal with asylum seekers sent to it by the United Kingdom in accordance with the principle of non-refoulement. The necessary changes may not be straightforward, as they require an appreciation that the current approach is inadequate and a change of attitudes and effective training and monitoring is required. So the view of the Supreme Court, without a doubt, was it was a fundamentally flawed system that required major surgery. The government, on the 5th of December 2023, which was 19 days after the Supreme Court handed down their judgment, entered into a further agreement with the government of Rwanda, which they asserted put all of the problems identified by the Supreme Court right. On the 7th of December 2023, 22 days after the judgment was handed down, the government introduced into the Commons the bill which prescribed, despite the findings made by the Supreme Court, that it, and I quote the bill, now an act, it gives effect to the judgment of Parliament that the Republic of Rwanda is a safe country. It is hard to imagine a more obvious breach of the separation of powers, because you are asking, as the government, and getting Parliament to state they, as a court, will decide on an issue of fact. It's perfectly okay for Parliament to change the law in the face of a legal ruling by a court. The Parliament can say, we don't like the law, so we'll change the law. But what you cannot do, it seems to me, is let Parliament start making decisions of fact. The obvious thing that you would start to do is to say, although my very good friend X, who is a member of Parliament, has been convicted of a criminal offence, I know X to be a very decent chap, so we're passing an act of Parliament that declares that X is an innocent fellow, even though the courts have found him guilty. The Rwanda law then provided that every decision maker must conclusively treat the Republic of Rwanda as a safe country, and it further provided that the courts must not consider a review or appeal against a decision either of the minister or of an immigration officer on the basis Rwanda is not a safe country. It passed without significant amendment in the form introduced. There was one amendment, but it's not material to this argument. The courts effectively usurped, and then legislatively barred from putting it right. The law, as far as the UK courts are concerned, absolutely clear. The courts of the United Kingdom are unquestionably, under our constitution, and I don't challenge this, they are bound to give effect to the Act. Yet the Act is plainly unconstitutional because it breaches the separation of powers. Courts, not Parliament, decide the factual question of whether a country is safe. Passing the Act was plainly designed to circumvent court control of the executive. There is no remedy which the courts can give for its unconstitutionality. It is for Parliament to decide whether to pass it. In the Commons, the government have a majority, and they whipped it through. In the Lords, whilst we in the Lords are willing to amend bills to make the government think again, as we did with the Rwanda Bill, if the Commons think again and make no changes, then in the context not just of a bill what was in a winning party's manifesto, but any bill which is central to the programme of the government, then the Lords will not hold out. And we didn't hold out. We held out 3 times, and then we let the bill through. This Act and the Internal Market Act demonstrate a government or a state where politics can trump the Constitution. And there is no institution in our state, court or second chamber, which has the task of holding the government, which controls the Commons, to the Constitution. Would it have been different if the reforms of 2005 had not taken place? Most people accept the need for an independent Judicial Appointments Commission and for a fully functioning Ministry of Justice and for a Secretary of State who does not spend the great bulk of his day inert on the woolsack, and also the impossibility of a senior cabinet minister also being the chair of the final Court of Appeal and the head of the English judiciary. But they hanker for a big legal figure, such as the Lord Chancellors of old, who would, separately from the Attorney General, stand up for the rule of law within government. And if that great figure said no, and then he surely would have said no, or she would have said no to the Safety of Rwanda Act, that would have ended the matter. I fear not. Lord Kilmuir, the Lord Chancellor, was summoned by the Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Macmillan, at 11:15 a.m. on Friday, the 13th of July, 1963, an inauspicious day. With no prior warning, he was told he was to be replaced with effect from 7 p.m. that evening. He bravely went on with his diary for the day. It being a Friday, it only included one further official engagement, namely a cocktail party at the Land Registry. Houston, who chronicles the lives of the Lord Chancellors, writes, "It," that is the cocktail party at the Land Registry, "was not an occasion remembered with pleasure by anyone who was there." It is said, upon being told at 11:15 that he was to be fired, Kilmuir complained that he was being given less notice than he would have had to give his cook, to which the Prime Minister is said to have replied that cooks were much harder to come by than Lord Chancellors. Whether this exchange occurred, it illustrates how the whole structure depends on appointments by the Prime Minister. A cabinet minister should not be the head either of the Judiciary of England nor the head of the final Court of Appeal. It's fundamentally wrong. And it was from those two positions that the Lord Chancellor derived his special authority in government. There is no going back, nor should there be. That, the Lord Chancellor being the head of the judiciary and the head of the Court of Appeal, the final Court of Appeal, that was the classic failure to separate the judges from the executive and the legislature. There is a figure in government, the Attorney General, and if he or she thought it was unconstitutional or legal or illegal, he or she should have said that. And if he or she was overridden, then he or she would have had to resign, and then they would have had to find another law officer, which would have gravely undermined the commitment to the rule of law. There may, in the future, need to be more solid structural protections to protect the Constitution. For example, either the courts having wider powers to strike down or not apply parts of legislation which are unconstitutional, or a second chamber with wider powers to block unconstitutional legislation. I support neither of these proposals in this lecture. They would require much further thought. Rather, I seek to draw attention to the increasing gulf between that which is lawful and that which is unconstitutional. And we really need to look at that issue. The final condition to hold the government to the law and the Constitution is ensuring legal structures which apply appropriate limits to executive action. Increasingly, the executive promotes primary legislation, giving huge power to ministers and other bodies, which would previously have required either primary or secondary legislation. The four methods of circumventing proper parliamentary scrutiny, and in many cases any scope for legal challenge, were identified in a seminal joint report by two select committees of the House of Lords, published in November 2021, headed The Democratic Deficit. The day job of those two committees is to draw the House of Lords' attention to anything unusual in delegated powers the government is proposing by secondary legislation. The committees, which are made up of people from each political party, the cross parties, the cross benches and no party, became so concerned with what they saw as a fundamental undermining of the role of Parliament in favour of the accretion of executive power over a prolonged period of time that they published this report, which reflects very much the view of the Lords. They described the four methods used to shift the balance away from the legislature to the executive. First, skeleton legislation, where little of the policy is included on the face of the bill, but instead left to delegated legislation, which Parliament cannot amend, but can only accept or reject, with rejection being a very rare occurrence and fraught with difficulty. Second, Henry VIII powers, where ministers can, by a form of secondary legislation that they promote, repeal or amend a primary act of Parliament. Thirdly, legislative sub-delegation of powers, where ministers confer powers on themselves or other bodies, and these powers may include the ability to amend primary legislation. This tertiary legislation has as much legal force as any other form of law. And then finally, what the committees described as disguised legislation, perhaps the most striking and disturbing recent development, where ministers give themselves the power in prime legislation to exercise legislative powers using various devices such as guidance, determinations, protocols, which it is said will specifically have legal effect, but require no parliamentary scrutiny whatsoever. The wider the power given by primary legislation, because there is less material in primary legislation to define how it should be exercised, the greater the reduction in parliamentary scrutiny, but also the harder to identify any legal basis of challenge. Using these techniques is positively recommended in what is described as the Cabinet Office Guidance to Legislation, a manual for government departments and parliamentary draftsmen as to how to legislate. The Joint Committee's report recommended in November 2021 as follows. We therefore recommend significant amendments to the Cabinet Office Guide to Making Legislation, the Bible which officials must follow, including an explicit assertion of the fundamental principles of parliamentary democracy as the basis for the way in which bills are framed. Legislation which offends in one or other of the four ways the two Lords committees identified is unconstitutional for all of the reasons that they set out. It is a further example where legislation sets out the law, the courts have to follow that legislation without doubt, but the legislation is unconstitutional and there is nothing that either the courts or the second chamber can do about it. In this lecture, I've sought to identify what I believe to be a gradual but significant weakening of the constitutional and legal restraints on what the executive does. The main driver of this is the increasing intensity for political advantage. The ability of the state to hold the executive to the law and to the constitution is what prevents elective dictatorship. We must hope that the things I have identified have been the product of a period of aberration, and the triumph of politics over everything else is not the picture of the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Falconer. We have questions online. We have a roving mic here as well. We have circa 25 minutes for questions. Before we take questions within here, Berners in, I'll go to the online questions, if I may.
Certainly.
And actually, I'll take chair's privilege here. But we're here looking at how the UK constitution has worked, or does it need reform? And a couple of the notes that I've taken, given the 4 areas or the 4 elements that you highlighted, and it is the Euros as well, so I've got to put in a football analogy. It's a bit like VAR. What may be a good idea, but how is it executed? So what are the elements of execution that you look back upon now and go, this could have or should have been executed better?
Well, my lecture is criticising the way the government in the last 2 decades has mucked around with the Constitution. You referred in your introduction to me to the various changes in the Constitution that the Blair government was responsible for and which I participated in. I have absolutely no regrets about any of them because, as I said in the lecture, had we not done the changes about the appointment of judges, imagine what the Conservative government could have done in the face of the prorogation decision. They would have gone for the judge that they thought was most amenable. Now, the judges are fiercely independent in this country. Is there any institution in the world over a period of 20 or 30 years that if they think the politicians want a particular thing from the judges in order to get promoted, will not, perhaps some of them, start to give it? So I think in terms of the big constitutional structure, I don't think I do have any regrets about the way that the Constitution was put together or amended. In relation to the position of the Lords, what has happened with the Lords is that we have effectively stopped rejecting bills that are truly government bills. And that has occurred at a point when a government is willing to put forward unconstitutional bills. There's a terrible gap there. Why has that happened? It's happened in part because of people's dislike of the idea of a unelected second chamber, and it's impossible to change or reverse that now, because I think, whereas there was a point maybe 30 years ago where the Lords were quite respected, I think in the public's eye the Lords are quite defined by people like Baroness Mone and Lord Lebedev. And is it really possible politically for, as it were, Baroness Mone and Lord Lebedev to be saying no to bills produced by an elected government? We can, as a group, say no to non-government bills, but we can't, I think, realistically resist the settled conclusion of the elected House.
Thank you. You mentioned a Lord there, and it leads into my second question here. We've talked about judiciary, we've talked about constitution, we've talked about government. You've mentioned people. We're in the midst of an election campaign. We've not heard media. They did allude to that with your enemies of the people headline. I've often said the media may not tell us what to think, us, the people, but the media does tell us what to think about. And that word about is critical. What's your view on the media in terms of informing us, the people, and our views of the judiciary?
Well, whatever one thinks about the media are absolutely critical to the way that the state runs. Jefferson, in America, when offered the opportunity of having no Senate and a media, decided that the media would be more important than a Senate. And I mean, what do you make of the fact that the post office scandal didn't do very much, even though Mr. Justice Fraser, as he then was, delivered an absolutely seminal judgment, which absolutely cut through what the post office was saying about their own conduct in relation to it. And Mr. Justice Fraser's judgment is a very, very impressive judgment, two judgments. It doesn't make much impact until there is a ITV television programme which reveals in a way that is accessible what the postmasters went through. So the media is you've got to take the media and treat it as part of the landscape. Now, the enemies of the people headline is the Daily Mail, and it's so unfair, and judges aren't the enemies of the people, but it was reflecting a view which is, there's a sort of elite in London that's stopping us who wanted Brexit to properly realise our potential. And so I don't think the Daily Mail invented that thought. I think that is a thought that is quite powerful in the country anyway.
Thank you, sir. Right, I'm going to open the questions to the floor. So anyone who'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, state your name. Can I have the mic here, Sophie? Thank you. And then if you keep your arms raised so I can just see straight down. Thank you.
You suggest it would be unconstitutional for the Commons to overturn the conviction of somebody on the basis that he was actually really rather a good chap. What do you think about the constitutional implications of the suggestion that the postmasters' convictions should be overturned by Parliament rather than by going through the normal appeal process?
I think the court process became impossible for the sub-postmasters. If it was going to be done in court, although the Court of Appeal was very willing to do it very, very quickly, most of the sub-postmasters were not willing to participate anymore in a court process. You could have got round that by saying the Lord Chancellor or the Attorney General could refer unwilling cases to the Court of Appeal. And indeed, the former Lord Chief Justice, Lord Burnett, pointed out that previously the Home Secretary had the power to refer miscarriages of justice cases to the Court of Criminal Appeal before the Commission was set up. But you can't really do an appeal if the person does not want to have anything to do with it. In the old days, when the Home Secretary referred cases to the Court of Appeal, he did it usually after being begged by the convicted defendant to do it. Here, most of the postmasters will not cooperate. And you can understand why, because it's taken so long. The state, because the post office is wholly owned by the state, actively misled people as to what was going on. In the exceptional circumstances of the post office, and it has support right across the political spectrum, I think you should allow it. The danger is not this sort of exceptional circumstance like the post office. The danger is you use your majority against the wishes of the minority in the Commons to let your friends off. And that was not what was happening in the post office case. And imagine if the only constitutional protection that worked was the one that prevented them getting quick exoneration. Every single other constitutional protection for them, the honesty of the prosecutor, the obligation of the prosecutor to make proper disclosure, the requirement that you only be convicted if there's no reasonable doubt, the ability of the defence to ask for documents, the judicial process, which is a good judicial process, which is determined to ensure you're only convicted if there's no reasonable doubt that you're innocent. And all of those constitutional protections failed the postmasters, and then they're told, I'm sorry, you can't have exoneration for years because we've got this other one. And I just don't think it applied there. But I take your point, David, that you need to see it as an exception.
So if I just come back to that, was the Act acquitting the postmasters unconstitutional?
No, it was not, because it seems to me it was something that they could pass, and there will be exceptional circumstances, it seems to me, very, very exceptional, where the legislature may have to step in effectively where the court system is not of itself capable of remedying the wrong. And the court system was not of itself capable of remedying that wrong.
Okay, thank you. Next question in the auditorium, I think, at the back, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To go back to something that the chairman touched upon about the people and the media, over the last few elections that have been fought, everyone can probably think of the government's position on things like the NHS. Their position on the justice system is probably much more foggy, because it probably has to be said that the justice system is not at the forefront of many people's minds. How do you think we need to go about raising that awareness within the public and the state of legal education in the country?
I think the critical thing about the media is it has to be a free press. Therefore, a free press has to decide what it talks about and writes about. And politics and the media go together in this respect. The public is probably more interested in schools and healthcare than they are in justice. The way, as far as I can see, that one deals with the absolutely seminal importance of the justice system and the need to protect it is never going to be through persuading the media to write about it, though they will write about it from time to time, but making sure that the importance of justice and the court system is part of what people are taught in schools. Because, nobody ever questions the amount of money we spend on elections, because people understand that's vital to our democracy. But the rule of law is equally vital to the continuation of democracy, because you can't have a democracy without the rule of law. People, if they were aware of that, would have a much, much greater anxiety, I believe, about the state of the justice system at the moment. But you're never going to persuade you're not going to see headlines saying judges came to a rather clever decision, or judges proved to be clever, or judges proved to be just. That's just not the way the world operates, I'm afraid. So you can't tell the media what to write about, but you can build it in much more into our education structure, how important it is.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up a couple of points online before I come back to the audience here. Prime Minister May fulfilled the Brexit referendum result, despite the fact that Vote Leave was guilty of campaign overspending and other elements. Did Prime Minister May fail to protect democracy?
No, I don't think Prime Minister May did fail to protect democracy. I think what happened was we did decide as a country to leave the European Union. That was contrary to the wishes, probably, of a majority of Parliament, the MPs, in 2016, and probably contrary to a majority of MPs in 2017 as well. The consequence was that we had a Commons that was both out of tune with the public, and also, for the reasons I indicated, we had a government that couldn't control the Commons. So what happened during that period was that the Commons ceased to function as an effective leader of the nation. Is that letting democracy down? No, I don't think so. I think I honestly greatly admire Mrs May because she really tried her best to get a deal. The deal that she got was in very many respects not that different from the deal that Johnson got. But Johnson was an unscrupulous politician who put his own interests first, I think. So I don't think she undermined democracy, but I do think the way that the Commons came to a dead stop between 17 and 19 is what led to the 2019 result.
So when you talk about the Commons, second point, it's related to the second point here. You've mentioned it throughout the lecture as well. Is the second chamber, as appointed, not fit for purpose? If so, what would you recommend?
It is fit for a particular purpose, and the particular purpose it is fit for is amending legislation in areas that are not at the heart of politics. So we spend a lot of time making lots of legal amendments that are, by which I mean that make the process in court easier, which are sensible amendments, but and that's quite important. But and it's fit for that purpose. It's not fit for the purpose of being the defender of the Constitution. And underlying my lecture, hopefully it surfaced in it, is the proposition that the Constitution in many areas can't be protected by the courts through no fault of the courts and isn't being protected by a second chamber. So you need to change the balance there somewhere. So it's fit for a purpose. It is not fit for the purpose of being a constitutional guardian.
Fantastic, thank you. Question here, please. We'll have the mic coming to you.
What do you say to the view that many of the ills of which you speak, for example, conflict with the courts, breach of power, the separation of powers, those ills, of which I suspect most people here would agree they are ills, have been facilitated at the very least by the absence of a fundamental law known in other countries as a written constitution, something against which you can measure the activities of the executive and parliament.
Thank you.
It is obvious that if, for example, the Constitution prescribed a rigid separation of powers, subject maybe to exceptions in exceptional circumstances, and the courts could rule on that, then the separation of powers would be protected. And it would follow from that, for example, the Safety of Rwanda Act could have been struck down by a Supreme Court or some big constitutional court. I have very grave misgivings about that because the strength of our judges is they are very, very unpolitical. Nobody really knows whether it's a right-wing judge or a left-wing judge or a liberal judge or a not-so-liberal judge. The moment you start to have, quote, a fundamental law, which a court can make rulings on, you then become interested in the politics of the judges. And you can see that in the United States of America. I mean, Trump appointed people who would set aside Roe and Wade. And it becomes, it's such an underminer of the strength of our judges because they are perceived completely rightly to be selected only on legal and judicial merit, not on the basis of what their politics may be. So I can see it would be a protection, but it would have a terrible consequence on the strength of our judges. I think the answer lies much more in the second chamber, but that requires fundamental reform. It does not lie with the judges becoming more engaged in politics. I think Johnson was wrong when he said after the prorogation decision, well, that was a political decision, and long may that continue.
Have the microphone here, and then I'll take the one at the back as well. Madam.
Thank you. You were talking about a big beast standing up for the constitution within government. Do you think it would help if the attorney was a member of the cabinet?
Well, it's for the Prime Minister of the day to determine whether the attorney goes to cabinet. My experience when I was the Solicitor General was that the Attorney General did attend cabinet each time, and my experience when I was in the cabinet was that the Attorney General always attended cabinet. I think formally the Attorney General is not a member of the cabinet. But I don't think that makes a difference. I think ultimately the Attorney General, because of the eco-structure, is a very powerful figure in government. If he or she says this is against the law or against the Constitution, that stops it. And you have to get rid of the Attorney General if you want to, and find an amenable Attorney General if you want it to continue. I mean, that is the worry about the eco-structure, because it follows from the fact that the bill, the Safety of Rwanda Bill, was presented, that the Attorney General, Victoria Prentice, who is well regarded, and Alex Chalk, the Lord Chancellor, also well regarded, both approved the bill, when it is really beyond argument that it offends against the separation of powers. And that is an indication of the fact that the whole legal eco-structure in government was willing to allow that to happen, which is very bad. I don't think it would make a difference one way or the other if the Attorney General was formally a member of the Cabinet.
I'll take the question at the back, but before then, if you can hold the mic, please, just online. You mentioned about the Supreme Court and one of the areas that you introduced here in the UK in 2005, I think it was. And the question really is, obviously, 4th of July, Independence Day, and looking at the US election and what may happen, and what you reflected on in terms of previous appointments to the USA Supreme Court. The Supreme Court here cannot be held to account, otherwise it risks losing its independence. Can this be a risk if they gain too much power for existence, as in USA?
Yes, and I do think there is a risk if they got too much power, by which I mean the power to strike down legislation. I'm very against them having that power. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is a completely different creature from the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So I'm against it getting that power for all the reasons I indicated in the answer to the question there about a lack of a fundamental law, because I don't want the judges to get into play in politics. What's going on in America, my reflection on what's going on in America at the moment is you watch, and it is absolutely shocking, you watch the leading figures in politics coming to New York effectively to picket the criminal trial of Trump. So the Speaker of the House of Representatives came, as did a huge number of representatives, to, in effect, put pressure on the judge, and the judge, to his enormous credit, was unpressured, and as far as I could see, conducted that trial brilliantly. But these were the leading politicians in the state saying there's something wrong with our justice system. And when that gets to the Supreme Court, as it's bound to, that question, there's a majority of right-wing members of the Supreme Court who will probably let Trump off, because there are genuine legal questions about the crime for which he was convicted. But that's politics completely wrecking the justice system in America, I think.
Thank you. The question from gentleman at the back. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that the House of Lords is fit for a particular purpose.
Yeah.
Do you think that it would be more fit for that particular purpose if lords and ladies weren't political appointees and were appointed on the basis of subject area expertise?
You can't take politics out of Parliament, basically. And the idea that it would just be a collection of teachers, doctors, lawyers, judges, all sitting around and reaching conclusions, I mean, it would become a completely... I mean, the reason we have politics is people get together in political parties because they have shared aims. I just don't think you can have a fully expert house. And therefore, I think there's scope for there being some people who are there, as it were, because of the expertise they have. For example, it would be a good thing probably if the ex-Lord Chief Justices came to the House and the ex-Cabinet Secretaries and the ex-heads of the military came. But fundamentally, it's got to be an elected chamber, in my view, because only if it is elected does it have any authority. I became a peer because I shared a flat with the man who became the Prime Minister. The rest of the people there became peers either because their great-great-grandmother had slept with Charles II, or they'd given donations to a political party, or they were regarded as rather splendid sort of managers of business. It's such a random and unsatisfactory way of choosing your second chamber. So I don't think we can continue on that basis, or on the basis of sectorial expertise, because who would that leave out?
I'm glad we don't do recruitment like that here at Gresham College. I'm going to take one more question here, and I've got closing words. If I can have the mic, and I'll take the question from the gentleman here. I can see many hands, apologies.
Well, thank you for a magisterial lecture where you outlined, I think, and you've given the answer to the first part of your question, that the UK Constitution has not worked. And, of course, the question is this just an outlier, or is this something that is now baked into our system for the future? And I think you put forward, in terms of potential reform, two candidates, which is the House of Lords or the Supreme Court. And you've explained, as I understand, why you prefer the House of Lords to the Supreme Court. I'm just wondering whether, in relation to the Supreme Court, you're being too pessimistic, because both France and Germany have constitutional courts where they do precisely the sorts of things that you've indicated, and I'm not aware that either of those courts are held in the same form of disrepute, if I can put it, or as political as the US Supreme Court. So my question is, we do things, if you like, in a very British way in this country, and I feel that you may be being too pessimistic about the ability of judges in this country to carry out that task.
Thank you.
Very good question. I completely agree with you that in relation, and I'm most acquainted with France, the French highest constitutional court, which is chaired by a man called Laurent Fabius, who is a politician, in fact, but he's a distinguished lawyer as well, makes decisions of the most far-reaching sort without a flicker of anybody complaining about it. And that has been the position, not Laurent Fabius has been the chair of the court, but that has been the position in the constitution for decades in France. My judgment would be that we would not be like France, that the French justice system is fundamentally different from the British system. And if you need a guide, I think it is the US system that we should use as the one that would indicate what would happen more. The US system, in very many respects, has its origins in our system, except for this constitutional role of the Supreme Court, indeed other courts as well. But I just, and I mean, one could go on for a long time on this question, but I just think that the American example is much more likely to be the one that would be followed, and I'm not in favour of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Falconer. We have a number of hands up in the audience. I've got a lot more questions coming in online. But I'd like to call upon the Right Honourable Lord Justice Peter Coulson to say a few words of appreciation. Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege of being the Treasurer of Gray's Inn this year. At the opening of the legal year in October, the beginning of October, I cornered Lord Faulkner and I asked him to give this reading tonight. He couldn't get away, and I was in all my robes, so I'm quite large anyway, and with the robes I'm very large, and he obviously decided he had no option but to say yes if he wanted to see his sandwich again. So he said yes. Now I have to say that at that time I didn't know that there was going to be a general election. Unlike the Tory MP, I didn't have a flutter. But I did know this, and it was one of the reasons why I was keen for him to do this reading. In 20 years' time, less a week, Lord Faulkner swore me in as a senior circuit judge, a very happy occasion. And I have seen him and come across him on a number of occasions where he is a complete master of whatever it is he's talking about. I would be prepared to wager that you won't hear a better speech, talk, lecture about the current constitutional issues in this country than you've heard tonight. It has been one of the privileges of my year to have him speak to us for the last hour. So I would ask you please to show your appreciation for Lord Faulkner.